Smith and the Pretenders on the way this afternoon. You're listening to BBC Radio Oxford. Now, let's think historically, shall we? When you think of Queen Victoria, an image of empire and great power probably comes to mind. But it could all have been very different if a young lad who fired a pistol at her when she was only 3 years into her reign had been successful. There were to be further assassination attempts on the monarch that ruled over vast areas of the globe, and these assassination attempts have become the subject of a new book by Barrie Charles. The book is called Kill the Queen, the 8 Assassination Attempts of Queen Victoria, and Barrie joins me this afternoon to talk more about this subject. Welcome to the show.
Hello, yes.
I did say that I had a little bit of an issue saying Kill the Queen this year in particular. I thought somebody might come in and drag me out of the studio, but obviously it's all in context. This is the story of Queen Victoria. What first inspired you to this subject?
Well, I've been interested in history, and particularly the Victorian period, for some considerable time, and I was looking round for a particular topic to feature on. And in fact, the spur actually came from a course I did here in Oxford with the University Continuing Education. And a chap there, Stephen Wade, who's one of the tutors, came up with the idea, and I thought, yes, that's a good one. Because
you aren't a trained journalist, you weren't a historian. In fact, your day job, as it were, is a very different field.
Well, yes, I'm lucky to have had quite a variable career from where I started off in physics and computing and then into marketing. I did do a bit of journalism towards the end of the 2000s, but I really got into the history side of things really through family history. That's where a lot of people start off. Started researching my own ancestors, and I found that absolutely fascinating, and I became fixated with it and spent a lot of time on it.
Were there any names in your family tree that you were particularly drawn to, that you wanted to learn more about?
Oh, yes. Well, my mother's ancestors go by the name of Silwood, which is quite an unusual name, and it was known in the family that my great-grandfather had come to an unfortunate end in Epping Forest. And I spent a lot of time researching his life, which led to an earlier book of mine, because his claim to fame was basically he was murdered, probably by a poacher in Epping Forest in 1909. Most of his career was as a soldier, and he was well decorated in the Boer War. And I found it just amazing how much I managed to uncover that was unknown in the family about his early life, about what happened to him in South Africa during the war, and all these resources that I found, like local newspaper reports, even national newspaper reports, and that was an earlier book that I published, was on that subject.
You must have found quite, I suppose, time-consuming and needing an awful lot of intricate detail in this research when you're doing something as personal as a family member's history as well. Did you ever think that you were biting off more than you could chew with this initial project?
No, I never thought that, but it's very true that it does need a lot of careful research.
You can't go into it half-hearted, can you?
No, you can't. It can take up a lot of time, and you have to be very methodical. Because of my background, particularly physics research, where you have to be equally methodical, I'm, quite happy with that. But you can spend, many days researching things which, don't turn up anything fruitful. But then when you hit something, you think, wow, that's filled in another little piece of the puzzle about this person that I'm trying to find out more about.
Who'd have thought that physics research would tie in so nicely in tracing your family tree? Yes. Let's move now on to the new book, Kill the Queen. What did you know about Victoria's reign before you embarked on this?
Well, I knew some because of the book I'd done about my great-grandfather, who was a soldier in her service. But I didn't know really anything about these attacks on the Queen at all. So I started off, obviously, by reading a few biographies of Victoria, and found that, they just merited a paragraph or two. And indeed, what they said, some of the statements were actually conflicting, so there were some inaccuracies in there. So I used that as a starting point, the list of the times that there were attacks, and then went from there, reading newspaper reports, looking at the background of the people involved, and then delving into more interesting archives, like in the National Archives, things in the British Library and other archive offices.
Well, we'll look at some of the individual attempts in a moment or two, but what sort of time span did these assassination attempts take place in? Were they quite close together, or was it across her, as we all know, very long and mighty reign?
Well, it was pretty much across it, although they did come in spurts. The first was, as you said, in 1840, 3 years into her reign, and the last by an individual was in 1882, although the last chapter of my book is about the so-called Jubilee plot, which was a Fenian plot to cause a dynamite atrocity during her Jubilee year. The Fenians, of course, were the Irish freedom fighters of the time. So it covers from not all of her reign, but certainly most of it.
Yeah, pretty much most of it. Quite a wide span for you to be getting a picture of how these attempts affected the royal household, how they affected the greater public as well. And what we'll talk about in a moment or two is what happened after these attempts. What happens when somebody tries to kill a monarch and it doesn't go according to their plan? We'll be talking more with Barrie in just a moment or two. You're listening to the afternoon show here on BBC Radio Oxford. Back after this from Gabrielle.
They can't come true.
Oxford. Hearing a little bit about the 8 assassination attempts on Queen Victoria's life this afternoon, the subject of a new book called Kill the Queen by Cholsey writer Barrie Charles. Now, you've divided these men, because it was all men, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yes.
Into 3 different categories. Tell us about the categories.
Well, it's a shorthand. I call them mad, sad or bad. A lot of them were mentally unstable in some way, and there's not a lot of reason behind their attacks. But a lot of them were also sad. Basically, they were seeking notoriety. Some of them were really on the breadline, starving, and thought that, if I have a pot shop at the Queen, not only will I be well known and recognised, but I'll also be put in jail, put in an asylum, and I'll at least get a square meal.
Wow. And last, the bad.
The bad, who were mainly Fenian terrorists, prosecuting their cause, and that particularly applies to this plot of 1887 that I mentioned earlier. But they were in the minority compared to the mad and the sad. Well,
let's go back to the first attempt on her life, which, as I said, was only 3 years into her reign. Who was responsible for this?
Well, there's a chap called Edward Oxford. He was only 18 years old. A lot of them were still youths. He was what they described as a pot boy, which is a waiter in a public house. But he had delusions about himself. He saw himself as going to cause great events in the country. And he had a pot shot at her on Constitution Hill. Victoria went out every day, more or less, in an open carriage, so she was, plainly in view. And he not only fired 1 pistol at her, but he fired 2. She wasn't hit, obviously, and he was immediately arrested, tried for high treason, but he had a good defence. All the lunatic asylum experts of the day were there, and he was pronounced mad. And he was sent to Bethlehem Hospital, which is the source of the word Bedlam, by the way.
Yeah.
And he spent basically 27 years in Bethlehem and then later at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. But I don't believe he actually was mad. He may have had youthful delusions, but he was in fact highly intelligent. His initial period in Bethlehem was it was very hard for him. But later the regime eased. He had access to the library, and he managed to teach himself 3 languages, which he could write fluently, and 3 others smattering.
So did he develop some sort of notoriety through this? Because to set yourself up for potentially being committed to a lunatic asylum in Victorian days wasn't something you were going to take lightly.
No, well, he obviously wasn't quite thinking clearly when he did it. But in fact, probably one of the reasons why there were so many further attempts was because of him, because people saw that he wasn't drawn, hung and quartered as they were then. He was actually given a life in an asylum which was painted as an easy one. So other people followed his example.
Seeing it as some sort of meal ticket.
That's right, yes.
Now, your research obviously has delved into the British archives, but it also took you to Australia, a place that you lived previously, because there was quite an Australian connection in terms of the fate of some more of these would-be assassins.
That's right, yes. I mean, 3 of them were transported, which was what was going on in very large numbers at that time. Was transported to Van Diemen's Land, which is now called Tasmania, of course, or to New South Wales. And another 2 of them ended up there semi-voluntarily. The Edward Oxford I've just mentioned was finally released on condition he emigrated to the colonies. So 5 of my chapters end in Australia, so I spent some time going around the archive offices, the cemeteries and other places in Australia, collecting more details to flesh out the stories.
Well, I can't wait to find out a little bit more about your Australian research and what you discovered there to bring back to put in the book, Kill the Queen. We'll hear more from Barrie in just a moment or two, and if this is a subject that you'd like to learn more about, maybe you'd like to get your hands on a copy of the book yourself, be telling you about a couple of events that are going to be coming up in Cholsey for the launch of the book. But first, let's get the very latest on the roads, because Gemma has our details. And you'll hear more from that in your news at 3 o'clock. Right now, though, talking with Cholsey author Barrie Charles about his book Kill the Queen, the assassination attempts on Queen Victoria that numbered 8. You'd begin to get a bit of a complex, wouldn't you, if you were the Queen? All these people out to get you. What sort of effect did these repeated attempts have on the general British public?
Well, I mean, in general, it was outrage, of course. There were elements within the community, particularly people like the Irish, who had been suffered badly in the hands of the English, who were probably in favour, but the vast majority were certainly outraged by it.
Was the monarchy popular?
It came and went. There were periods when it was quite unpopular. Prince Albert, that we look back on now as someone who helped build the throne, at the time was seen as a German. He couldn't even speak English when he first came. But in fact, these assassination attempts actually raised the popularity of the crown, because of course there was a wave of sympathy for Victoria and hence Prince Albert as well.
Did it have any effect on her psyche, as a ruler?
Well, yes, I mean, she was amazingly determined, going through all of these things. She said a few things about the subject which are written in her diaries. One of the things she said was that American assassins seem to have better aim, because during her reign 2 of the American presidents were killed by assassins, were shot. She also noted, of course, that it was mainly she was shot up in carriages which were moving. They were old flintlock pistols, so if they missed, which they often did, then you were fine. The thing that affected her the most, in fact, was the one assassin that didn't use a gun, who actually attacked her with a stick, a cane, which had a metal end to it, and hit her on the brow. And that was the one that upset her the most, because it was so painful and she had the mark of it for many years afterwards. Was
that the only one that actually managed to do a degree of harm to her?
That's right. That's the only one that actually physically harmed her.
Coming back to Australia, and you mentioned, was it 3 of the assassins that didn't quite achieve what they were looking to do were transported to Australia? Were they able to rebuild new lives there? What's known of what happened next?
Well, I've found out more or less everything about what happened next to all of them. The 3 who were transported and the 2 who went there semi-voluntarily. They had, the ones transported had a terrible time in the labour camps, particularly in Van Diemen's Land, which was a horrible place. But in fact, the second would-be assassin, who was the first to go there, once he emerged from the labour camp, he was a carpenter in England. He became a builder. He went to live in Launceston, which is in the middle of Tasmania, where he won the contract to build the hospital. So that shows how far he had progressed, and he became quite a well-off man. You got some great illustrations as well, some that you have sourced from British publications, but some photos that you took yourself, including the grave of, was it John Freeman? That's right. That's Edward Oxford changed his name to John Freeman once he got to Melbourne, which is a very appropriate name, I think. For obvious reasons. And he did very well. He rose in society. He even was invited to the Governor-General's parties. Really? Yes. Because people didn't know that he was the same person. He lived in Melbourne and eventually died there, and it was great fun going around the cemetery looking for his grave and eventually finding it. When you were talking and working, I suppose, with the historians and archivists in Australia, were they surprised to know that there's still such interest in Victoria's reign and how these men could have brought it to an untimely end? Well, I think they were all interested in the subject of the book, but in fact that whole history tends to be of great interest to Australians now. And there was a time when they sort of rejected their convict past, but now lots of Australians are really keen to find out, whether they are related to convicts and how how their family history plays out. And indeed, I made contact with one or two who are, in fact, descended from these people. There are family lines still? Yes. Yes. That would be something to bring up at a dinner party or when you're meeting your potential in-laws. Now, this Friday, you're giving the public a chance to get a hold of the book. You've got a couple of launches, haven't you? That's right, yes. In Chelsea, we have set up a community library, which is run almost wholly by volunteers. And on Friday evening, we're having an event for the Friends of Chelsea Library and the people who work there as volunteers. And then on Saturday, between 10 and 12 in the morning, we are having an event for the public, which will include an exhibition, signings, question and answers, and so on, which is in the Free Church. Were there any men that you were writing about in this book where you felt sympathy or empathy towards? Yes, actually quite a few of them. I mean, one of the things that the Victorian courts weren't very good at diagnosing between the mad, the sad and the bad. And a lot of them were classed as bad when in fact they were mad or sad in the other categories. And a lot of them were forced to do something. I mean, the conditions then for many people were very hard. I mean, if you are nearly starving and nobody seems to be able to help you at all, desperate times, desperate measures. Exactly. Exactly. It's going to be a really interesting read. I can't wait to find out more. The book is Kill the Queen, the 8 Assassination Attempts on Queen Victoria. Barrie Charles, the author, thank you so much for coming in, and all the very best on Friday as well. I know that your appetite for all things historical hasn't been quenched, though, because you're working on another book, and I'd love to have you come back and tell us more about that when it's completed. Oh, thank you very much. Barrie Charles here on BBC Radio Oxford. Have you got an interesting history to share? Somebody in your family may...